One of the things I find most interesting and frustrating about studying history is how misrepresented women are. Alewives were not witches, and Boleyn did not deserve to be beheaded, and Marie Antoinette never said, "Let them eat cake." But there were also women whose accomplishments were just too enormous to be ignored. I think Hildegard of Bingen was one of those. Welcome, friends. I'm Jim Hodgson, filmmaker and comedy writer. I am so pleased to be part of Crafted for Action again. Thank you to Jen Price and the rest of the team for having me back. It's a great honor. Honestly, I can't believe it's been a whole year since the last one, but here we are. If you're watching this later, not affiliated with Crafted for Action, click on the link below to find out more about this outstanding conference. As I say, I'm a filmmaker and comedy writer, so my work is a lot more informal than that of a proper historian, but I will include sources in the description for anyone who wants to get more deeply into the subject from actual historians. So that said, let's go. Hildegard of Bingen intersects with the story of beer because she's often cited as the first to write down that using hops with beer or other beverages has a preservative effect. And without that insight, none of us would be getting together for Crafted for Action because the beer industry could not be an industry. Okay, that's a little bit of a lie. Someone else would have figured out hops as a preservative somewhere along the way. In fact, they already knew. Other people mention hops and brewing alongside one another as far back as 3 centuries before Hildegard of Bingen, during the reign of the Carolingian king Pepin the Short, who was the son of Greg the Stinky. I'm just kidding. Pepin the Short was real, but Greg the Stinky isn't. But 2 things. First, in their writing, those guys before Hildegard weren't as clear about the preservative effect as Hildegard was. And second, none of them could hold a candle to her in terms of overall brain size. They were boring, and in my view, compared to Hildegard of Bingen's intellect, morons. Looking at you, St. Adelhard. Hildegard of Bingen was born at the end of the 11th century, around 1098, near Bingen, which is in the western part of Germany, just outside Frankfurt by about 20 miles or 50 kilometers. My friend Rob lives in Frankfurt and was kind enough to run out to Bingen and take a few photos, such as this monument in the modern-day town of Bingen. Here's a Hildegard statue as well. Now, the only payment Rob asked for was that I also show a photo of his dog, Doc. So great work, Doc. Hildegard came to prominence early in her life because she had religious visions of herself rising to heaven. And because of these visions, and possibly also because Hildegard was physically differently abled in some way, she was described as sickly, her parents offered her to the church as an oblate. An oblate is someone who is living and working at a monastery but isn't a monk. They could also be living in normal lodging outside the monastery but working closely with the monastery. Her parents might have done this for a lot of reasons. Maybe it was partly a political move, like it made them seem like better members of the local society to give a child to God this way. Maybe it was clear that Hildegard was not cut out for normal paths through life, so they were trying to find some way that she could be safe and prosper. We don't know for sure. As an adopted person myself who's also been shipped off at one point in my life, I feel complicated about children being given to the church, but in Hildegard's case, she absolutely thrived. We get the sense that she was at least okay with it, if not pushing for it herself. So, as I say, Hildegard gained fame and notoriety early in her life because of her visions. She saw herself rising to heaven, surrounded by holy spirits, and she wrote it all down. I don't want to be disrespectful about anyone's religious beliefs, let alone someone as significant and fascinating as Hildegard of Bingen, but it's a little difficult for me to accept the ecstatic visions part of her life, but the church at the time loved it, and that helped propel her as a significant religious figure. We can imagine how that might have worked. At first, Friends and family are amazed by young Hildegard's visions. Then word of her work spreads. It eventually reaches local luminaries in the church who see an opportunity to help spread God's message, and so on. Once in monastery life, she was highly respected by her peers and would later be elected to leadership roles. And much later on, she was offered other opportunities in the church as well, but turned those down because she wanted to found her own monastery with her closest followers. Now, the only problem with her idea of founding her own monastery was that her abbot said no. So she went over his head and got permission, but the abbot still wouldn't budge, so Hildegard threw a fit. She was stricken with an illness that caused her to lay in bed, unable to move. Now, she said that she's gotten this illness because God was so upset that her abbot told her she couldn't found her own monastery. So at this point, it seems a little bit like Hildegard used her fame, her notoriety, and her reputation for a close relationship with God to throw a bit of a religious tantrum to get what she wanted. But right or wrong, it worked. The abbot relented, and she was allowed to take 20 of her nuns to found their own organization. This is Rupertsberg, the monastery on the site where Hildegard founded her organization. I believe the structures that were standing in her day are gone, but there is this plaque on the side of the building which remembers her. This is St. Hildegard in Eibingen. They still have Hildegard relics and a shrine to her as well. Hildegard was a German Benedictine, meaning that she followed the rules set out by Saint Benedict of Nursia. Now, if you think of a monk in the Middle Ages, you probably think of someone in very simple clothes, praying and doing hand labor type work all day. That's most likely a Benedictine or derivative thereof. If you're into Trappist beers, as I am, as often as I can be, the Trappists are an even more strict religious order than the Cistercians, who are an even more strict religious order than the Benedictines. But Hildegard was no ordinary monk or nun. What differentiated her, aside from the visions, was the enormous breadth and depth of her intellect, in addition to her work ethic. She was a writer, a philosopher. She wrote about medical procedures, methods for farming, and she also composed tons of music. There's really not much in the world that escaped Hildegard's notice. She thought about everything, did her best to put pieces together, and then wrote it all down. Even as someone who lived a long life, as she did, it's unbelievable to me the amount she managed to accomplish. This is the St. Stanislav Girls Choir of the Diocesan Classical Gymnasium from Slovenia, performing Hildegard of Bingen's work, De Spiritu Sanctu, Holy Spirit, Quickener of Life. The next song at that concert, Dude on the Hurdy-Gurdy, played the entire guitar solo from Pink Floyd's Comfortably Numb, and they asked him to leave. Okay, I made that up. Why are hops so important? Well, in Hildegard's time, they were the best choice for preserving beer. If you do any cooking, you know that if you're going to go to the trouble to make something, like cookies, for example, it's often as easy to make 24 as it is to make just 6. But if you don't have enough people to eat up 24 cookies, well, that's not ideal, because I think we all feel the weight of wasted cookies deep down in our souls. When I was a kid, you could be forgiven for almost any mistake around the house except wasting food. You catch hell for that. There's also the matter of the rule of Saint Benedict, which are the rules that you have to follow to be a Benedictine. Now, the rules say that your superior, your monk boss basically, gets to determine how much wine or beer monks or nuns get to have per day. If your superior is very strict, it could be none, or a very small cup, or maybe your superior is cool and everyone gets to have as much as they want until they start tumbling down the church steps and making a spectacle of themselves. Regardless, St. Benedict was adamant that monks should not grumble about having access or not having access to wine or beer. I quote, "However, where local circumstances dictate an amount much less than what is stipulated above, or even none at all. Those who live there should bless God and not grumble. Then he repeats himself. Above all else, we admonish them to refrain from grumbling. St. Benedict did not have time for grumbling monks. But I think we can see how a monk charged with brewing beer for the monastery could feel like grumbling. They knew they could make more beer every time they brew, which would reduce their workload, but that was pointless because it would just go bad. The same story with selling off excess beer to the townsfolk to support the monastery. It's a much better source of funds if the beer lasts long enough to get to local inns, people's houses, and so forth. Nobody wants to buy a barrel of beer that's a day from going bad. But if you add hops as a preservative, you get a little benefit in terms of added taste, but an even larger benefit because the beer lasts longer. Hops do this because they have acids which act as an antimicrobial in the beer. So when little microbes or other gremlins get in the beer and try to turn it skunky, the hops are not having any part of it. They shut those microbes down. Now, you can also preserve beer longer by keeping it cold and keeping oxygen away from it. But those are two things that are much easier to do today than they were in the 12th century. Now, I realize as I say that, I'm talking to people who know how to brew beer, and you're probably thinking, actually, low oxygen practices aren't that easy today either. But it had to be even harder when dealing with handmade barrels rather than machine-made fittings and stainless steel and that sort of thing. In terms of her work in medicine and science, Hildegard saw the human body the way it was seen at the time. In those days, the body was thought to be made up of 4 different humors corresponding to different colors. So if you were depressed, it was probably because you had too much black bile or melania colae, which is where we get the word melancholy. She also saw herbs that way, which is why she described hops as a hot, dry herb. So if someone had too much phlegm, which corresponded with cold and moist temperament, you could give them hops or sage, which are both hot, dry herbs. Easy as that. Here's what Hildegard had to say about hops in particular in her work Physica. Hops, Hafo, is a hot, dry herb with a bit of moisture. It's not much use for a human being since it causes melancholy to increase, gives him a sad mind, and makes his intestines heavy. Nevertheless, its bitterness inhibits some spoilage in beverages to which it is added, making them last longer. But hops wouldn't work for a depressed person because black bile is cold and dry, and hops as a dry herb would increase your dryness. Honestly, it makes about as much sense to me as actual modern medicine does, which is why I'm not a doctor. I just eat whatever pills they tell me to and slather on whatever cream they put in front of me. Near the end of her life, Hildegard was embroiled in a scandal around a boy who was excommunicated after he died. Now, part of being excommunicated from the Catholic Church is that you aren't allowed to be buried inside the church grounds. So, because this boy had been excommunicated after he was buried, a lot of people wanted his body dug up and removed from the convent's cemetery. But Hildegard said, no, we are not doing that. He was part of the church when he died. He received his last rites. His body gets to stay. There was speculation that Hildegard was not canonized or made into a saint because of this scandal in the last year of her life, but it also seemed like she wasn't canonized for obscure bureaucratic reasons. Hildegard died on September 17th, 1179. She was 81 years old. In addition to all I've mentioned here, she left behind volume after volume on theology, morality, just about everything. She also started work on inventing her own language. It's just impossible to overstate how brilliant she was. But she was also not made into a saint for a long, long time. Now, this gets into some pretty deep Catholic lore in which I am by no means an expert, but I think we can agree that being sainted is probably something Hildegard of Bingen would have wanted, and given her significance, I think she deserved it. In 2012, Hildegard of Bingen was fully sainted by Pope Benedict XVI, not a moment too soon. To quote Matthew Fox from his book Hildegard of Bingen, A Saint for Our Times from 2012, one of the greatest honors a person can receive in the Roman Catholic Church is to be declared not only a saint, but also a doctor of the Church. The canonization of Hildegard of Bingen in October 2012 by Pope Benedict XVI is a landmark in more ways than one. If you're enjoying a beer today, as I certainly plan to, you will almost certainly be enjoying something that contains hops. And maybe in there, just about 1,000 years later, is the spirit of Hildegard of Bingen as well. Maybe we'll all feel a little bit smarter, a little bit more prolific, and a bit more confident in our own decisions. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I'll be kicking around the conference all weekend. I'd love to meet you, so I hope you'll say hello. Thanks again to Crafted for Action for having me.